Kang Tae-jun's world had been dark for 4 years, and now, for the first time, light nearly broke him in half. He stood frozen in the middle of a crowded ballroom, cameras flashing around him like small explosions, and all he could focus on were 3 small faces near the dessert table. A girl with braided hair. 2 boys, nearly identical, but not quite. Something about the shape of that girl's eyes made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't know these children. He had never seen them in his life. So why did looking at them feel like looking into a mirror he didn't recognize? His surgeon had warned him that his brain would need time to relearn faces, colors, distances. But this wasn't confusion. This was recognition, trying to claw its way to the surface and failing. Then the woman standing behind the children turned, and Tae-jun's entire body went still. He didn't know her face, but something in him did. Before we go further into what Tae-jun saw that night, and why his own body seemed to remember a woman his mind could not, subscribe to this channel now, tap the like button, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. You will not want to miss where this story goes. 4 years earlier, Kang Tae-jun had been the kind of man Seoul both feared and admired. 30 years old at the time, heir to one of the country's largest shipping and construction conglomerates. A man who could end a business deal with a single sentence and never raise his voice doing it. Then came the accident. A curve on the coastal highway, brakes that failed at the worst possible second, and a hospital room where doctors told him gently that the damage to his optic nerve was permanent. Kang Tae-jun, a man who had never depended on another human being for anything, woke up blind. He never let the world see his eyes again after that. From the day he left the hospital, he wore a pair of black glasses everywhere. Boardrooms, family dinners, the quiet of his own home. Some assumed it was vanity, a proud man refusing to look damaged in front of people who used to fear him. The truth was simpler. He didn't want pity dressed up as concern. Behind those dark lenses, the world could wonder, but it could never stare. Everyone assumed his wife would leave. Aaliyah Carter Kang did not. She had married him 8 months before the accident. A Black American woman who had come to Seoul on a design scholarship and stayed for reasons she never fully explained to anyone, not even herself. Their courtship had scandalized his mother and delighted the tabloids. But when the cameras and the curiosity faded, what remained was a woman who sat beside a hospital bed for 6 weeks, watching a stranger adjust to being blind, learning the particular stillness of his face beneath those black glasses before she ever learned to read what was underneath them. For nearly 2 years after that, Aaliyah became his eyes in every sense that mattered. She read his contracts to him in a voice steady enough that board members forgot to feel sorry for him. She learned which tie he preferred by the texture of the fabric under her fingers, since he could no longer see the pattern. She walked half a step ahead of him through hallways, angling her shoulder just enough that he'd know a doorway was coming without ever having to ask. Sometimes, late at night, she would reach up and gently remove the glasses herself, just to press her forehead to his, because she was the only person in his life who never needed him to look a certain way to be loved. There was only one wound in their marriage that time did not heal. They wanted a child. Month after month, nothing came, and Madame Kang, his mother, elegant, composed, endlessly present in her son's life since the accident, made sure that absence was never allowed to rest quietly. "A shipping empire needs an heir, Tae-jun," she would say. Always gently, always at the exact moment his guard was lowest. Not affection, not devotion, an heir. He defended his wife every time, until the day his mother placed a folded medical report into his hands and asked him to have someone read it to him. The words on that page told him his wife could not have children. Ever. And 3 days after that, another envelope arrived. Photographs. Aaliyah, meeting a man outside a private clinic on the other side of the city, on more than one occasion, always when Tae-jun believed she was at a design consultation. He confronted her the way a drowning man grabs at anything within reach, desperately, and without care for what he was pulling down with him. Aaliyah tried to explain. She said the man in the photographs meant nothing close to what his mother wanted him to believe. She reached for his hand the way she had 1,000 times before, guiding him through a room he couldn't see. He pulled his hand away. "I can't spend the rest of my life believing you stayed with me because you knew I could never see what you were hiding," he told her, and even behind those black glasses, she could see his jaw tighten the way it always did, right before something in him broke. She left the mansion 3 days later with 2 suitcases and nothing else. Madame Kang did not attend the divorce proceedings. She did not need to. She had already gotten everything she wanted. What none of them knew, not Tae-jun, not his mother, not even Aaliyah herself in that exact moment, was that 3 weeks later, in a small clinic on the outskirts of Seoul, Aaliyah would collapse from exhaustion and wake up to a doctor telling her words that would change the rest of her life. She was not infertile, she was pregnant, and she was carrying not 1 child, but 3. She sat on that examination table with her hand pressed to her stomach, tears sliding down her face for reasons that had nothing to do with grief anymore, already imagining the moment she would tell Tae-jun. She had no idea that somewhere across the city, Madame Kang had already found out before she had. And Madame Kang had already decided exactly what she was going to do about it. Madame Kang did not raise her voice when she found Aaliyah 2 days later. She never needed to. She simply appeared at the door of the small rental apartment Aaliyah had moved into after the divorce, dressed as though she were attending a board meeting rather than delivering a threat, and set a manila folder on the kitchen counter like she was leaving a gift. 3 children, she said, glancing at the folder, then at Aaliyah's stomach, which had not yet begun to show. How extraordinary, and how inconvenient. Aaliyah's hand instinctively moved to protect herself, though there was nothing yet to protect against but words. "Get out of my home! This was never your home," Madame Kang said pleasantly. "It was a guest room in my son's life, and the guest room has been cleared." She opened the folder anyway, turning it so Aaliyah could see the documents inside. Bank transfers, falsified signatures, a paper trail meticulously built to look like Aaliyah had been stealing from the Kang Company accounts for over a year. "You will take whatever you're carrying, and you will leave Korea, quietly. Or my grandchildren will grow up reading about their mother's embezzlement trial in the newspapers. They're not embezzlement documents, they're fabricated. Fabrication only matters to people who still believe truth wins," Madame Kang said. And for the first time, something colder moved behind her composed face. "Tae-jun believes what I tell him to believe. He has for years. Do you understand me now?" Aaliyah did not answer. She didn't need to. Madame Kang had already turned to leave, pausing only at the door to add, almost as an afterthought, "Congratulations, by the way. 3 heirs my son will never know he has. What a waste." Aaliyah told herself it was an empty threat. Rich women who lost their sons to blindness, and their daughters-in-law to divorce, liked to feel powerful in whatever small ways were left to them. She told herself that until the night, 11 days later, when she came home to find her apartment door already unlocked, her drawers pulled open, her private letters to Tae-jun, the ones she had never had the courage to send, gone from the box where she kept them. Nothing was stolen. That was the part that frightened her most. Whoever had been inside hadn't wanted her belongings. They had wanted her to know they could get to her belongings, and by extension, to her. She packed 2 suitcases that same night and was on a flight to New York within 36 hours, 4 months pregnant and utterly alone, save for the flutter of movement from 3 separate heartbeats. When she finally settled somewhere permanent 2 years later, it wasn't New York, it was Seoul again. A different district, a different name on her design portfolio, close enough to watch over the company from a distance, far enough that no one from Tae-jun's world had reason to cross her path. She told herself that was the safest kind of hiding. She didn't yet know how wrong she was. Tae-jun spent those same weeks in a house that had gone very quiet. He asked about her once, to his mother, in the flat voice of a man determined not to sound like he was asking. Madame Kang told him Aaliyah had taken a settlement and left the country to start over somewhere she wouldn't have to look at what she'd lost. He believed her, because believing anything else meant admitting he had let the only person who ever truly saw him walk away over lies he never verified. He kept the black glasses on. He told himself it no longer mattered whether anyone could see his eyes, since there was no one left he wanted looking into them. Now, 4 years later, standing in the middle of a charity ballroom with his sight fully restored, Tae-jun couldn't stop staring at the woman gathering 3 children near the dessert table. He didn't know her. He was almost certain of that. And yet something under his ribs kept insisting otherwise, some old muscle memory his eyes had never used before tonight, reacting to a stranger the way a hand reaches for a light switch in a room it hasn't stood in for years. "Who is that woman?" he asked quietly, leaning toward the event coordinator at his elbow. The coordinator checked her guest list. "That's Ms. Carter. She designed the auction pieces for tonight. Quite well known in interior circles. Would you like an introduction?" Carter, not the name he'd braced himself for, and yet his pulse didn't seem to care what surname the list gave him. "No," he said, too fast, and then, because his mother's hand had already found his arm, "Actually, yes." He crossed the ballroom before Madame Kang could stop him, close enough now to see details a distance had blurred. The particular tilt of one boy's eyebrows, the shape of the girl's eyes, all three children achingly familiar in a way he couldn't yet name. The woman turned as he approached, and up close, something in her face detonated quietly behind her composure. Recognition, and beneath it, fear. "You can see," she said, before he'd said a word, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound of her voice hit him harder than her face had. He knew that voice. He had spent 2 years memorizing it in the dark, and some part of his brain that his surgeon hadn't been able to fully repair reached backward across 4 years and finally placed it. "Aaliyah," he said, and the name left his mouth like it had been waiting there the whole time, unrecognized until sound gave sight what it alone could not. She flinched. The little girl beside her tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, you're squeezing my hand." Aaliyah loosened her grip immediately, but she didn't take her eyes off him. "How long have you been able to see?" 6 weeks. He glanced down at the children again, and the ache in his chest sharpened into something closer to panic. "Aaliyah, whose children are these?" "Mine," she said, too quickly, too sharply. "I didn't ask if they were yours. I asked whose they are." Madame Kang's fingers dug into his arm. "Taejun, this isn't the place." He shook her off, something he had never once done in 4 years of dependence on her. "Answer me," he said to Aaliyah, and his voice cracked on the second word in a way that made several nearby reporters lower their glasses of champagne to listen closer. Aaliyah gathered all 3 children against her, one arm wrapping protectively around the girl's shoulders, and for a moment, Taejun thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Then she looked directly at him, and there was nothing soft left in her voice. "Their father doesn't know they exist," she said, "and he never will." She turned and walked toward the exit before he could respond, 3 small children hurrying to keep pace with her, and Taejun stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, with his mother's hand once again finding his arm, gripping tighter this time, as if she could feel exactly how close he had just come to the truth she had spent 4 years burying. "Let her go," Madame Kang whispered. "Whatever she's hiding, it isn't your concern anymore." But Taejun was already staring at the security footage playing silently on a screen near the entrance, watching Aaliyah's face as she hurried past the cameras. And for one unbearable second, before she vanished from frame, he saw the tears already sliding down her cheeks. Whatever she was protecting those children from, it wasn't him. It was something she thought he had already become. Aaliyah didn't stop moving until she was 3 blocks from the hotel, the children's shoes clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. She hailed the first taxi she saw and bundled all 3 of them inside before allowing herself to breathe. "Mommy," it was Noah, the older of the 2 boys by 4 minutes, the one who noticed everything before anyone told him to. "Why were you crying?" "I wasn't crying, baby." "You were," said his sister, Mira, matter of fact in the way only a 4-year-old could be. "Who was that man?" Aaliyah pressed her lips together and looked out the window at Seoul, sliding past in a wash of light. And for a moment, she was not a successful designer, with 3 healthy children and a life she had rebuilt with her bare hands. She was a woman who had spent 2 years learning to be someone's eyes, only to be discarded the moment those eyes could see something ugly enough to believe. "Someone I used to know," she finally said, which was true, and also the smallest lie she had ever told her children, because Kang Taejun was not someone she used to know. He was the architecture underneath everything she had built since, the reason she checked over her shoulder in parking garages, the reason she'd changed her last name on every document that mattered, the reason her children had never once heard the word father spoken in their home without her changing the subject. Across the city, Taejun sat in the back of his car while his mother spoke without pause beside him, her voice smooth and practiced, laying explanation over explanation like fresh paint over a crack that kept showing through. She clearly remarried Taejun, started a family. It happens. People move forward. Madam Kang reached over and patted his knee, the gesture of a woman soothing a child rather than a 34-year-old CEO. You should be glad. It means she's happy. She looked terrified. Not happy. You've been blind for 4 years and sighted for 6 weeks. Forgive me if I don't trust your read on a stranger's face. He turned to look at her then, and something about the ease of her lie caught on an edge in him he hadn't known was there. She isn't a stranger, you know that. You knew her name before I said it. Madam Kang's expression didn't so much as flicker. I know the name because I read the event program, same as you could have. Carter, common enough surname. She folded her hands in her lap. Let it go, Taejun. Whatever she's running from, it has nothing to do with us. But that word, running, sat wrong in the car for the rest of the ride, because he hadn't told his mother that Aaliyah had looked like a woman running from something. He'd only told her that she looked afraid. His mother had filled in the rest herself, and Taejun, staring out at the city he could finally see again, filed that detail away in a part of his mind that had spent 4 years learning to notice what people didn't say. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study with the lights off, an old habit from his blind years that he hadn't yet unlearned, and thought about the children's faces the way a man turns a coin over and over, trying to catch the light at the angle that reveals the counterfeit, the girl's eyes. He knew those eyes. Not from a memory of sight, he'd had none of Aaliyah's face while they were married, but from photographs he'd seen since regaining his vision, old wedding pictures his assistant had shown him during his recovery, back when looking at his ex-wife's face had felt like an academic exercise rather than a live wound. Aaliyah's eyes. The girl had Aaliyah's eyes, set into a face that otherwise carried none of her softness, a sharper jaw, a straighter nose. His nose, though he'd never been able to confirm that himself, not being able to see his own reflection until 6 weeks ago. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant, Jisoo, a young woman efficient enough to never ask why her boss needed strange things done at 2 in the morning. I need everything on a designer named Carter, he said. Works the Seoul social circuit. Interiors, high-end auctions. Should I ask why, sir? No. By morning, Jisoo had a name. Aaliyah Carter, no hyphenated Kang attached to it anywhere in 4 years of public record, an address in a quiet residential district, and a birth registration for Triplets, born 8 months and 11 days after Taejun's divorce was finalized. Taejun stared at that last document for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. 8 months and 11 days. He did the math 3 separate times, as though repetition might change the answer, as though his newly restored eyes were somehow still unreliable. They weren't. The math stayed exactly the same each time. If those children had been born 8 months and 11 days after his divorce, that meant Aaliyah had already been pregnant, visibly, undeniably pregnant, while his mother had been placing a fabricated infertility report into his hands and calling it proof. His stomach dropped the way it had during the accident, that same sickening lurch of the world tilting sideways beneath him. He thought of his mother's voice in the car, gentle and certain. She clearly remarried, started a family. People move forward. She had looked him directly in the eye and lied to a man who had only just learned, 6 weeks ago, what it meant to be lied to by someone whose face he could finally see. Taejun set the papers down on his desk with hands that weren't quite steady, and for the first time since the surgery, he was almost grateful for the 4 years of darkness that had taught him how to listen for what people weren't saying. Because his mother had just told him everything in the careful, elegant shape of what she'd left out. He didn't confront his mother, not yet. A man who had spent 4 years learning to read silence understood that confronting her too soon would only teach her to build a better lie. Instead, he did something that would have been unthinkable to the old Taejun, the one who trusted his mother's word the way other men trusted gravity. He had Jisoo quietly arrange a private paternity test, using samples lifted from the children's abandoned juice cups after Aaliyah's assistant had cleared the auction table, left behind in the general clutter of a charity event no one thought twice about. It felt like a betrayal even as he ordered it, a violation of a woman who had once given him 2 years of her life without asking for anything back. But some part of him needed the truth to come from science, not from his mother's mouth, not even from Aaliyah's, because he no longer trusted his own judgment enough to believe either of them without proof. The results came back 9 days later. 99.9% probability of paternity. All 3 children. Taejun sat with that number in his study for over an hour, the black glasses he still wore out of habit resting on the desk beside the report, his bare eyes fixed on nothing at all. He was a father. He had been a father for 4 years and hadn't known it. Somewhere across the city, 3 small people carried his blood, his name unspoken in their home, his face reflected in theirs, and he had spent every one of those years believing his own wife had betrayed him, rather than given him the one thing he'd always wanted. He went to her that evening without calling ahead, standing on the doorstep of a modest house in a quiet residential district, until Aaliyah opened the door and went pale at the sight of him. "You need to leave," she said immediately, moving to block the doorway with her body. "I know they're mine." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I had a paternity test done." "I know, Aaliyah." Something in her face crumpled, not with guilt, but with an exhaustion 4 years deep. "You went behind my back to steal my children's DNA. I went behind your back because you were never going to tell me the truth on your own." He heard how harsh that sounded the moment it left him, and softened, though his voice still shook. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried." The words came out of her like something long damned finally breaking loose. "I wrote to you. I called your office every week for 2 months. I even came to the mansion once, and your security turned me away at the gate before I got within 100 meters of the door. Every letter I sent disappeared. Every call got redirected to voicemail that nobody ever returned." "That's not possible. I would have known." "Your mother told me you would never believe me," Aaliyah said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that undid something in his chest. "She told me if I kept trying to contact you, she'd make sure I lost the children in a foreign court, where I had no standing and no money to fight her. So I stopped trying. I left the country. I changed my name on every document I could. I spent 4 years teaching myself how to disappear so my children could grow up safe, and you're standing on my porch asking why I didn't just tell you." Taejun stood there in silence, and for the first time since regaining his sight, he understood that seeing clearly and understanding clearly were not the same thing at all. He had spent 4 years blind, believing a woman had betrayed him because his mother told him so. He had spent 6 weeks sighted, and he still hadn't seen the truth until a lab report forced it into his hands. "I believed her over you," he said quietly. "For 4 years. I believed her over the woman who spent 2 years being my eyes." "Yes," Aaliyah said. "You did." "I'm sorry." The words felt insufficient even as he said them, small and useless against everything they were meant to cover. "I'm so sorry, Aaliyah. I don't know how to make this right." "You don't," she said, and there were tears on her face now that she didn't bother hiding. "There's no making this right, Taejun. You divorced me while I was pregnant with your children. I raised 3 babies alone in a country that wasn't my home, changing addresses every few months, because I didn't know if your mother meant what she said about taking them from me. I missed my own sister's wedding because I was afraid to leave Korea and afraid to stay in one place too long. And you want to stand on my porch and ask how to make that right?" Behind her, in the hallway, a small voice piped up. "Mommy, who is that?" It was the girl, Mira, peering around her mother's leg with the same eyes Taejun saw in the mirror every morning now. Aaliyah's whole body went rigid. Taejun looked down at his daughter for the first time in his life, aware of her in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork or lab results, and something in his chest cracked open completely. He started, and had no idea how to finish that sentence. How 4 syllables could possibly hold what he needed them to hold. Aaliyah cut in, before he could find the words. "He's nobody, sweetheart. Go back inside. Go join your brothers." Mira disappeared obediently, but not before casting one more curious glance over her shoulder. And Taejun stood on that porch, feeling something he hadn't felt in the entirety of his sighted life so far. Not the shock of the ballroom, not the sting of the paternity report, but something quieter and far more devastating. His own daughter had just looked at him like a stranger, and for the first time, Tae-jun understood that this wasn't a mystery he could solve with money, with lawyers, with the full weight of the Kang name behind him. It was something he was going to have to earn, one impossible day at a time, and he had absolutely no idea if Aaliyah would ever let him try. Aaliyah didn't slam the door. That was almost worse. She simply closed it, quietly, with the particular control of a woman who had spent 4 years learning not to let her hands shake in front of her children. And Tae-jun stood on the porch listening to the lock turn. He didn't leave. He sat down on the front step instead, in his tailored suit, in the cooling evening air, and waited the way he used to wait during his blind years for someone to tell him it was safe to move through a room. An hour passed, then another. When Aaliyah finally opened the door again, the children's voices had gone quiet somewhere behind her. Bath time, bedtime, the ordinary architecture of a life he had never been part of. "You're still here. I didn't know where else to go." It was the most honest thing he'd said all night. "Aaliyah, I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm not asking you to let me back into your life, or theirs. I just need you to know I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." "You said something similar 4 years ago," she said. "Right before you told me you couldn't spend your life believing, I chose you because I knew you couldn't see what I was hiding." The words hit exactly as hard the second time, maybe harder, because now he understood how wrong he'd been to say them. "I know. I have to live with having said that for the rest of my life. But I'm asking you to let me try to become someone worth trusting again, slowly, however long it takes." Aaliyah was quiet for a long moment, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "Do you know what the hardest part of these 4 years was? It wasn't hiding. It wasn't the fear, or moving every few months, or raising 3 babies with no family nearby. It was watching them grow up without ever hearing the word father mean anything real. Noah asked me last year why he didn't have one like the other kids at his preschool. I told him some families just look different. He was 4 years old, Tae-jun, and I was already lying to him to protect him from a truth I didn't think he'd ever need to know. You don't have to protect them from it anymore." "I don't know that yet," she said. "I know your mother nearly destroyed me once already. I know I still don't understand how a blind man's brakes fail on a road he's driven 100 times. I know I spent 4 years assuming that accident was exactly what it looked like, until I started wondering, somewhere around year 2, whether it was ever an accident at all." Something cold moved through Tae-jun's chest. He hadn't questioned the accident in years. It had simply been the immovable fact around which the rest of his life reorganized itself. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't trust easily anymore, and I have good reason not to." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "If you want to earn something back, Tae-jun, it isn't going to be with a paternity test or an apology on my porch. It's going to be showing up, consistently. For them, not for me. And even then, I'm not promising you anything." "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." She studied him a moment longer, as though weighing something heavier than the conversation they were having. "There's a school recital in 10 days. Noah's class is singing. If you come as a stranger who happens to be in the audience. You don't approach them. You don't tell them who you are. You watch, and you leave, and you see if that's really something you can do, showing up with nothing asked of you in return. I'll be there." "Don't say that like it's easy," Aaliyah said. "Say it like you understand what it costs to keep a promise you've already broken once." Tae-jun stood on the step, looking at the woman who had once memorized the sound of his footsteps well enough to know which mood he was in before he said a word, and felt the full weight of everything he had thrown away for a stack of documents his own mother had forged. "I understand," he said. "I'll be there. Every time, for as long as it takes." Hello, lovelies. Do you think Tae-jun deserves a second chance? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe if you haven't. Aaliyah nodded once, something in her shoulders loosening a fraction, though her guard didn't fully drop. "One more thing," she said, before she closed the door for the second time that night. "Your mother is going to find out, you know. She's going to find out faster than you think, and when she does, she isn't going to sit quietly and let you undo 4 years of work. Whatever she did to keep us apart, Tae-jun, she did it because she wanted something badly enough to fake a medical report and destroy her own son's marriage. Women like that don't stop because they got caught once. I'll handle it, Taejun said. And for the first time since regaining his sight, something in his voice sounded like the man Aaliyah remembered from before the accident. Not the blind, dependent version his mother had spent 4 years controlling, but the CEO who used to end business deals with a single sentence. I've spent 4 years letting her decide what I was allowed to see. That's over. Aaliyah closed the door. Taejun walked back to his car alone, and it wasn't until he was halfway home that he realized he'd left his black glasses sitting on her porch step, forgotten in the dark for the first time in 4 years, and somehow, he found he didn't want them back. Madam Kang found out within 3 days, exactly as Aaliyah had predicted. It wasn't Taejun who told her. It was Jisoo's assistant, a young man who owed his position to a favor Madam Kang had called in years earlier and had never forgotten he owed. He mentioned, in passing, over drinks with a colleague who happened to work in Madam Kang's household, that the young master had requested a paternity test and a full background file on a designer named Carter. The colleague repeated it to someone else. By the time it reached Madam Kang, it had traveled through 4 mouths and lost none of its danger. She came to Taejun's office without an appointment, which she never did, and closed the door behind her with a softness that made the click of the latch sound like a verdict. "You had a paternity test done," she said. "Not a question. You knew they were mine." Taejun didn't look up from the report on his desk, though he'd stopped actually reading it several minutes earlier. "You've always known. You looked me in the eye in the car after the ballroom and told me she'd remarried and started a new family. You knew exactly whose children those were. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself." He finally raised his eyes to hers, and for the first time in his adult life, he watched his mother's composure genuinely falter, just for a fraction of a second, before she smoothed it back into place. "I've had 4 years to think about a great many things I never questioned while I was blind. I never questioned the infertility report, because you handed it to me, and I trusted you. I never questioned the photographs, because you gave them to me, and I trusted you. I never even questioned how convenient it was that every piece of evidence against my wife arrived through you, and only you." "Be careful," Madam Kang said quietly, "about what you're implying. I'm not implying anything yet. I'm asking. Why did you hate her so much that you'd fabricate a medical condition, destroy a marriage, and hide my own children from me for 4 years?" Something shifted behind his mother's eyes, a calculation Taejun had learned to recognize over decades of watching her negotiate. The moment she decided a lie was no longer worth the effort of maintaining it. "Because she was never going to be enough," Madam Kang said, and her voice had lost all its softness now, gone flat and hard in a way that frightened him more than any threat could have. "A shipping empire that took 3 generations to build, and you wanted to hand its future to a foreign woman with no lineage, no connections, nothing to offer this family but affection. Affection doesn't survive a hostile board takeover, Taejun. Affection doesn't protect 40,000 jobs when the market turns. I did what I had to do. You tampered with evidence. You forged medical documents. You threatened a pregnant woman until she fled the country. I secured this family's future. You nearly destroyed my life." Madam Kang's jaw tightened, and for a moment the two of them simply stared at each other across the desk. 4 years of unspoken tension finally surfacing all at once. "Your life was never in danger from me," she said. "Everything I did to protect you." The word protect landed strangely in Taejun's ears, catching on something Aaliyah had said on her porch step days earlier, a question he had let sit unexamined because he hadn't been ready to look at it directly. He heard himself ask it now before he'd fully decided to. Was the accident really an accident? His mother's face went very still. It was the stillness that told him everything, faster and more completely than any confession could have. He had spent 4 years learning to read silence, and his mother's silence in that moment was louder than anything she could have said. "Answer me," he said, and his voice came out unrecognizable even to himself, hollowed out by a fear that had been building in the back of his mind since Aaliyah first planted the question. "The brakes on my car. Was that you?" "You're upsetting yourself over nothing," Madam Kang said, too quickly, the practiced smoothness cracking at the edges. "The accident was investigated. The mechanics ruled it a fault in the manufacturing line. I asked you a question, Mother." She turned toward the window, her back to him, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone strange and distant, as if she were describing events that had happened to someone else entirely. "You were going to leave the country," she said. "Do you remember? 6 months before the accident, you told me you were considering relocating the company headquarters to be closer to Aaliyah's family in America. You would have taken everything 3 generations built and moved it across an ocean for a woman who had been married into this family for less than a year." She turned back to face him, and her eyes were dry, terrifyingly calm. "I never meant for you to be hurt permanently. I only meant to delay you, ground you here long enough to reconsider. I didn't know the mechanic I hired would tamper with more than the timing." The room seemed to tilt beneath Taejun exactly the way it had the moment he'd first understood the math on the birth certificate. His mother had not simply manipulated his marriage. She had taken his sight from him. 4 years of darkness, 4 years of dependence, 4 years of a life reorganized entirely around his blindness, as a calculated business decision. "You blinded your own son," he said slowly, "to keep me from moving a company." "I kept this family together," Madame Kang said, and for the first time, something like desperation entered her voice. "Everything I did so you would still have something left to inherit. Can you understand that? Can you at least understand that much?" Taejun stood up from his desk, his hands flat against the surface to keep them from shaking, and looked at the woman who had raised him, guided him through 4 years of darkness, and orchestrated every devastating turn of his life from behind a curtain of maternal concern. "I understand," he said quietly, "that I don't know you at all." Taejun didn't sleep after his mother left the office. He sat alone until the building emptied around him, replaying 4 years of his life through a lens that made every gentle gesture, every soft-voiced piece of advice, look like exactly what it had been: architecture, carefully built, designed to keep him small enough to control. By morning, he had made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him even a week earlier. He called an emergency session of the board. Madame Kang arrived at the meeting expecting to defend a business decision, some minor controversy involving overseas shipping contracts. That was the story her assistant had been told to spread, and she believed it completely, right up until Taejun stood at the head of the table and began speaking without a single note in front of him. "4 years ago, I lost my sight in a car accident that was ruled a manufacturing fault," he said, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. "I have since learned that the brakes on my vehicle were deliberately tampered with, on the instruction of a member of this board, to prevent me from relocating this company's headquarters. I have also learned that during my recovery, false medical documentation was used to convince me my then-wife was infertile, and fabricated evidence was used to convince me she was unfaithful. She was neither. She was pregnant with my children at the time of our divorce, and was subsequently threatened, surveilled, and driven out of the country to prevent me from ever learning the truth." The room had gone utterly silent. Several board members exchanged glances. Madame Kang sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her face arranged into practiced composure, though Taejun could see, for the first time, the fear moving underneath it. "I have documentation," Taejun continued, "financial records showing payments made to the mechanic who tampered with my vehicle. Records of the falsified medical report and its actual origin. Surveillance logs from a private security firm hired to track my ex-wife's movements after our divorce. All of it traces back to one person." "This is a family matter," Madame Kang said sharply, breaking her silence at last. "It has no place in a board meeting." "It has every place here," Taejun said, "because the person responsible sits on this board, controls a significant share of company voting rights, and has spent the last 4 years making decisions on my behalf, while I was blind. Decisions I am no longer willing to trust." He looked at her directly, and something in his gaze made her flinch, the first crack in her composure the entire room had witnessed. "I'm asking the board to remove Madame Kang from her position, effective immediately, and to support a formal investigation into the attempted vehicular sabotage that cost me 4 years of my sight." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the older board members, a man who had served under Taejun's father for decades, cleared his throat and asked quietly, "Do you have proof, Taejun? Not accusations. Proof." "I have all of it," Taejun said, and placed a thick folder on the table, the product of 9 sleepless days spent tracing every transaction, every falsified document, every thread his mother had spent years weaving to keep him blind in more ways than one. You're welcome to examine every page. The vote, when it came 2 hours later, was not close. Madame Kang left the building that afternoon, stripped of her position, her voting shares frozen pending investigation, her carefully constructed empire collapsing in the space of a single meeting. She found Tae-jun in the parking garage as he was leaving, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. "You've destroyed us," she said. "Do you understand what you've done? The company, the family name, everything I built to protect you." "You didn't build it to protect me," Tae-jun said. "You built it to control me. There's a difference, and it took me 4 years of darkness and 6 weeks of sight to finally understand it. And what happens now? You'll run to that woman and her children and play house, and forget everything I sacrificed." "What happens now?" Tae-jun said, cutting her off with a calm that frightened her more than any anger could have, "is that you're going to face whatever the investigation finds. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to earn back 4 years I can't get back with my children, and whatever trust I can with their mother. That's what happens now." He drove straight from the parking garage to Aaliyah's neighborhood, not to her house. He'd promised he wouldn't approach uninvited, but to the small park 2 streets over, where he'd learned, through careful and distant observation over the past 10 days, that she sometimes brought the children after school. He sat on a bench far enough away to keep his promise, close enough to see Noah attempt a cartwheel and fail spectacularly, close enough to hear Mira's laugh carry across the playground, close enough to watch the third boy, Kian, he'd learned his name was Kian, carefully collect fallen leaves into a small, serious pile, as though the task required his full concentration. Have you ever fought to become worthy of a second chance you're not sure you deserve? Stay with us, because everything Tae-jun has rebuilt is about to be tested one final time. Subscribe now if stories of hard-won redemption and unexpected twists keep you coming back, because what happens next changes everything. He didn't notice Aaliyah watching him from the far end of the playground until she was already walking toward his bench, arms crossed against the evening chill, her expression unreadable in a way that made his stomach tighten. "You removed her from the board," she said. "It wasn't a question. It's already all over the financial news." "I did." "That's not nothing, Tae-jun." Something in her voice had shifted, softened at the edges in a way it hadn't since the ballroom. "That's not nothing at all." She sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them, and for the first time in 4 years, they watched their children together in silence, 2 strangers who had once known each other completely, slowly, painfully, learning how to begin again. 3 months passed before Mira called him Daddy for the first time, and it happened by accident, the way the truest things always seem to. They were at the same park, though the bench distance between Tae-jun and Aaliyah had shortened by degrees over those months, the way trust does when it isn't rushed. A shared thermos of tea on a cold afternoon, a birthday cake he'd been allowed to help choose but not present. A Tuesday when Noah had scraped his knee and looked instinctively toward Tae-jun before he'd even realized who he was looking toward. Kian had taken longer to warm to him than the other 2, a quiet, watchful child who studied people before he trusted them, the way his mother once had. For weeks he wouldn't look Tae-jun directly in the eye, glancing instead at his shoes, his hands, the middle distance over his shoulder. Aaliyah had mentioned once, gently, that Kian did that with everyone new, held their gaze only when he'd decided they'd earned it. So Tae-jun never pushed. He simply kept showing up and let Kian look wherever he needed to look. Then one afternoon, without warning, Kian climbed onto the bench beside him and stared straight into his eyes for a long, deliberate moment, like he was checking for something. Whatever he found there, he seemed satisfied, because he didn't look away again after that. The children had started calling him Mr. Kang somewhere around week 6. That afternoon, Mira fell running toward the swings, and in the half-second of panic before she caught herself, the word came out of her without thought, the way words do when a child's instincts are faster than their careful, guarded vocabulary. "Daddy!" She froze the moment she said it, glancing toward her mother with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who wasn't sure if she'd broken a rule. Aaliyah didn't correct her. She simply looked at Tae-jun, something unreadable passing between the two adults over their daughter's head, and Taejun had to turn away and press the back of his hand to his mouth before either of them could see him fall apart on a public playground bench. "It's all right," Aaliyah finally said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "You can go to her." He crossed the playground in a few long strides and knelt in the wood chips in his tailored trousers, not caring in the slightest, and Mira threw her small arms around his neck, like she'd been doing it her whole life, instead of for the very first time. Noah reached them a beat later, wedging himself into the hug without invitation, the way he did everything. Kian hung back by the bench a moment longer, watching the three of them with his usual careful stillness. Then he walked over, and instead of joining the hug, he simply looked up and held Taejun's gaze, steady and unblinking, the way he now did with the handful of people in his life he'd decided were safe to really see. Taejun was beginning to understand exactly how Kian said the things he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. That evening, after the children were asleep, Aaliyah invited him inside for the first time in 4 years. They sat at her kitchen table, the same kind of ordinary table he'd never once pictured himself at during his years of boardrooms and glass towers. And for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. "I'm not going to pretend the last 4 years didn't happen," Aaliyah finally said. "I'm not going to pretend I've forgiven all of it either. Some days I still wake up angry. Some days I still see your mother's face in my sleep." "I don't expect forgiveness," Taejun said. "I don't think I've earned the right to expect anything from you. I only know I want to keep showing up, for as long as it takes, whether or not it ever adds up to something more than what we have right now." "And what do we have right now?" He considered the question honestly, the way he'd learned to consider things over the past 3 months, without the reflexive certainty that used to define him before the accident took it away, and slowly, painfully, gave him something more valuable back in its place. 3 children who are starting to trust me, each in their own time and their own way. A daughter who calls me daddy by accident, and a son who cried about it. A boy who finally decided I was worth looking in the eye. A woman who let me sit at her kitchen table tonight instead of leaving me on the porch. That's not nothing, Aaliyah. You told me that yourself, the day I removed my mother from the board. It's not nothing at all. Something in Aaliyah's expression softened, the guarded line of her shoulders easing by a fraction that felt, to Taejun, like the most significant shift he'd witnessed in 3 months of careful, patient rebuilding. 4 years ago, she said, you told me you couldn't spend your life believing I chose you because I knew you couldn't see what I was hiding. Do you remember saying that? I remember every word of it. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. Then you understand why I need you to know something now, while you can actually see my face when I say it. She reached across the table, not quite touching him, her hand resting close enough that he could feel the warmth of it without either of them closing the distance completely. I never had anything to hide from you. Not then, not now. Everything I ever did, I did in the open, even when it cost me everything to do it in the open. I want you to see that clearly, Taejun. Not just believe it, see it. If this story has taught you anything about what it means to truly see the people you love, not just with your eyes, but with your trust, let us know in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to make things right. And if stories of hard-won love and redemption speak to you, subscribe now, because there are so many more waiting for you. 6 months later, on a quiet afternoon in the same small park where they'd first begun to rebuild something neither of them had dared name yet, Taejun didn't propose as the CEO of the Kang Empire, with cameras and headlines and a diamond large enough to make the tabloids. He knelt in the wood chips in front of a woman who had once been his eyes when he had none of his own, with 3 children standing behind him, holding a small handmade sign. Noah had insisted on drawing the letters himself, crooked and mismatched. While Mira had covered nearly a third of it in stickers she refused to explain the logic of. And Kian, who never had much use for words, simply stood at the front, holding Taejun's old black glasses, the ones he'd left behind on a porch step months earlier, and Kian had quietly kept ever since, like proof of something worth remembering. I'm not asking you to forget 4 years, he said. I'm not asking you to pretend none of it happened, or that I deserve this as easily as I'm asking for it. I'm asking you to let me keep showing up. Every day, For the rest of however many years you'll let me have. With you, and with Noah, and Mira, and Kian, exactly as fast or as slow as each of them needs me to. Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment, and then at their children, at Noah already vibrating with excitement, at Mira beaming and utterly unsubtle about it, at Kian holding those old glasses like he understood exactly what they meant, and then, finally, at the ring in Taejun's outstretched hand, small and simple, nothing at all like the mansion and the empire that had once tried to define what love was supposed to look like. "Show me," she said, echoing words she'd once told him on a porch, step in the dark, "for the rest of your life." "For the rest of my life," he promised, and took the glasses gently from his son's hands before folding them closed for good. No darkness left to hide behind, nothing left unseen. Some love stories end the moment two people find their way back to each other. This one was only just beginning, because the truest kind of seeing was never about eyes at all. It was about choosing, every single day, to look at the people who matter most, and refusing to look away again.